Welcome back to another Stronger by Science video. I am Dr. Pak, and today we have a very interesting topic to discuss. And that topic is none other than spot reduction. Spot reduction is the idea that you can select where you're going to be burning fat off from when exercising, and sometimes also via the use of external devices, ointments, and so on and so forth. I'm sure many of you remember those classic late night TV ads with the ab belts or whatever they were called, that they were supposed to increase blood flow to an area that you wanted to target, usually that area being the abdomen, with the idea that you'd preferentially use fat from that specific area. But today we're not going to be talking about the use of external devices for spot reduction and the use of, creams and stuff. I'm pretty sure Ronnie Coleman was actually selling one of those creams at some point, or maybe he still does. But we are going to talk about the idea that you can perform specific exercises in order to spot reduce body fat. It is not uncommon to see people doing a lot more direct work for body parts that they want to define. Namely, again, that's usually the abs. People will often turn to doing crunches on crunches on crunches or whatever exercise in an attempt to better define that area, by hoping that they will preferentially use more body fat from that area versus just pulling body fat wherever that we're going to pull body fat from. As it stands in 2024, I'm pretty sure that a lot of you watching this, especially if you've been long followers of Stronger by Science, are probably not really hoping for much when it comes to spot reduction being effective. However, a few recent studies have come out, and there's been studies over the years that have directly explored the concept of spot reduction, which we're going to briefly look at today. Now, instead of doing a thorough literature review where we break down literally each study, I want to briefly go over the studies that have indeed found some form of spot reduction to exist, talk about their designs, their potential limitations, and if those are actually enough evidence for us to go ahead and place some stock on spot reduction being a thing. Keep in mind that the context here is not whether the phenomenon of spot reduction exists in general, but rather the context of spot reduction within the lifting world is that if you really want to burn fat from a specific area, you can achieve significantly greater fat loss from that area if you were to exercise it more intensely or with greater volumes, and so on and so forth. It's important to lay the context and understand that we are going to essentially look at spot reduction from the lens that it's usually presented in. Whether spot reduction is actually something that can occur in certain circumstances, different to what most of you watching and most experienced lifters would hope for from a spot reduction perspective. Let's look at the studies that have found some form of spot reduction being real, and the studies that are usually used in favor of spot reduction being real. Let's see what each study did, what they found, and some potential limitations. So, journey back in time. The year is 1965, and Mohr et al. Publishes the infamous paper called Changes in Waistline and Abdominal Girth and Subcutaneous Fat Following Isometric Exercises. Quite the interesting design here, and what they did is they took untrained women around the age of 18 to 40 years old and around 40 women, and without any changes to their diet. So they asked them to keep their diets as they were. They asked them to perform the following for 4 weeks. Daily isometric contractions, so 6 times 6 isometric contractions of 6 seconds, where they could do them either lying on the floor or sat on a chair, where they were asked to flex their abs daily, and they were required to not miss a day. They were required to do it, and it says specifically on the paper, during holidays, during weekends, during whatever. They had to do those 6 isometric contractions every day. They used skin folds and girth measurements in order to assess body fat changes. And here's what they found. So on average, participants lost a bit of weight, around half a pound, again on average. their waistline girth went from 25.5 to 24.9 inches. Their waistline skin fold went from 11.7 to 10.5 millimeters. Abdominal skin fold went from 29 to 27.8 millimeters. Statistical analysis, obviously keep in mind this was back in the day, was not very advanced. They also did not report standard deviations on the paper, and they noted that the changes obtained in the study, though not large, were significant. Thus, these results represent some evidence to support the hypothesis that isometric contractions can reduce body fat, thickness at the waistline, and the umbilical level of the abdomen. Now, aside from the measurements used being skin calipers and girth measurements, which come with their own limitations and are not necessarily the gold standard at assessing whether regional body fat changes, it is important to note that obviously the changes observed were not large whatsoever, and that's why I wanted to mention the actual absolute values that we observe, because statistical significance is often used in a way where you are not really informed about whether those changes in practice would actually make a difference. And it is very unlikely that the changes reported, and again, statistical significance will depend on the analysis that the authors used, which in this case was not the most appropriate. These changes are unlikely to have resulted in a change that you would visually notice. So that is also important. Plus, the tools that were used in order to assess body fat percentages were far from gold standards. So that's the study that essentially got the ball rolling when it comes to spot reduction research, which was then followed by another study a few years later, so 3 years later, in 1968, titled Spot Reduction of Subcutaneous Adipose Tissue by Olson et al. So they used untrained high school students from a physical activity program that were aged 14 to 16 years old. They used 32 people, and essentially they had them perform bicep and tricep exercises with one arm and nothing with the other arm. They did dumbbell curls and tricep extensions, 3 sets at around 7 RM. Based on the methods of the study, it wasn't fully clear whether they went to momentary failure, but it seems that they performed exercises with at least a relatively high intensity of effort. So they were relatively close to failure. Now, they also used skin fold and girth measurements, and the intervention took around 6 weeks to complete. Similarly to the previous study, the participants that took part were asked to not change their physical activity or dietary habits for the duration of the study. And what they found is that the arm that was exercising experienced a significant change in skin fold measurements, so they lost body fat. The non-exercise arm actually experienced an increase, which wasn't significant. And if we look specifically at the way that the skin fold measurements were taken, they note on the paper that in order to ensure the correct location and also to be certain that no part of the triceps was included in the skin fold, the subject was asked to tense the muscle. Then the subject relaxed the contracted muscle with his arm hanging freely at the side of his body. The skin fold was lifted parallel to the long axis of the arm. The calipers were placed next to the investigator's finger. The measurements were taken on the exercised right arm and also on the non-exercised left arm. Also proceed to say the data presented in this investigation are in agreement with Mohr, the study that we just briefly looked at, Mohr et al., who recently reported definite spot reduction in the abdominal area with isometric abdominal exercises. And they also support the statement made 75 years ago by Cheekley that fat disappears in areas where the muscles are active. Now, these statements made by the authors are far too absolute, in my humble opinion, based on the methodological quality of their study, their findings, the tools that were used, and also the changes that were observed. Now, it is important to note that aside from the potential of the skin folds caliper measurements to not have been insanely strict, we're again talking about untrained individuals, and in this case high school students, who engaged in resistance training for the first time with a relatively high intensity of effort, which is likely to cause some muscle gain in the span of 6 weeks given their training status. So it may be that they actually gained a bit of muscle, lost a bit of body fat, and that explains why these changes were observed. Also, the way the authors discuss the findings slightly hints at the possibility of some bias being there. Now, take that with a huge grain of salt. No malicious intent is implied by the authors, but the wording that was used in order to discuss the Mohr data that we briefly looked at is not very appropriate, again, given all the other limitations and the very limited literature on spot reduction that existed at the time. Let's move on though to the next study that was done many years later by Kostek et al. In 2007 called Subcutaneous Fat Alterations Resulting from an Upper Body Resistance Training Program. Allow me to note, we're simply looking at the pro-spot reduction studies that exist out there, just because I believe that if we look at all the evidence that has found an effect for spot reduction and critically analyze it, that puts us in a better place versus looking at all the studies that did not find an effect. And I'll briefly go over the amount of studies that are out there that have not found an effect and have potentially tested spot reduction in a more ecologically valid way. So again, untrained individuals, 18 to 40 years old. This time they had a very large sample size of 104 individuals, and what they did is they resisted strain on their non-dominant arm. They performed a variety of curls and tricep extensions that were not done to failure. So in this study, instead of using just calipers and girth measurements, they used calipers, so skin fold calipers, and MRI, which is much better than using just skin folds and girth measurements. So a lot of people, 3 months of resistance training on their dominant arm, again untrained individuals, and they found the following, and this is quite interesting: a significant reduction in trained arm subcutaneous fat determined by skin folds for all participants. If you look at the results of the study closely, they found the same for the untrained arm as well, for both men and women, when you look at the absolute difference, the absolute delta. So they also found a significant increase in trained arm muscle volume in men via MRI. Even the authors themselves said that in conclusion, spot reduction did not occur in the total sample in men or in women as determined by MRI. The conclusion that spot reduction is detected with skin fold calipers occurred in men is problematic because of the inherent limitations of skin fold calipers for detecting skin fold changes resulting from resistance training. So even though this study has been used as evidence pro spot reduction, even the authors themselves acknowledge that it's not really solid evidence for spot reduction. Again, we're talking about another cohort of untrained individuals who engaged in resistance training and saw some increases in muscle size and some decreases in fat. Moving on, Ramírez-Campillo et al. 2013 study called Regional Fat Changes Induced by Localized Muscle Endurance Resistance Training, and this is quite a banger when it comes to the methods, and you'll see why in a second. Untrained physical education students, only 11 people unfortunately, but those 11 people came in and they did one set of leg press on one leg, and they used the leg as a control. So they did one set on one leg and the other leg was used as a control group. And what they did is they performed 900 to 1,200 repetitions without any rest on that leg using just 10 to 30% of their 1RM. And they took around 4 to 5 seconds per repetition. This is actually a crazy design, and if we were to talk ecological validity and spot reduction, the idea that more blood flow to a muscle will allow you to burn more fat from that area, I mean, these guys were there repping for quite some time, for 12 weeks as well, and they did that once a week. Now, nutrition, again, no change. The researchers responsible were like, hey, guys, do not change your usual physical activities or your diet, and they used food questionnaires in order for them to report that. What they found was no significant changes in body weight, although they all lost on average about 1 kilo of body weight. They noticed a significant change in the fat mass of the trained leg, but if you look at the actual numbers, they reported a fat mass of 2.41 kilos going down to 2.39 kilos. And trained leg lean mass also slightly decreased, although that change was not significant. Interestingly, arm fat mass also significantly decreased, so they were not directly training their arm. So overall, again, the results of the study are somewhat mixed in the sense that there was a significant change in fat mass after 12 weeks, but that in absolute terms wasn't anything extreme, far from it. And at the same time, our fat mass was also significantly down, even though they did not directly train their arms. And participants, even though they were not supposed to change their diet, they did lose a bit of weight after 3 weeks, although not a lot of weight. Moving on to 2017, Palumbo et al. Effect of combined resistance endurance exercise training on regional fat loss. Now we had untrained women here, 25 to 40 years old, and just 16 of them. And what they did is the one group did upper body resistance training, and they did around like 3 sets of 10 at 60% 1RM. It was unclear if they went to failure, and I think that it is unlikely given the numbers and the percentage 1RM they listed. They did chest press, low row, arm curl, delt raises, and used also a triceps machine. And then after that, they did 30 minutes of aerobic exercise at 50% of their VO2 max on a cycle ergometer. So alternatively, the other group did lower body resistance training. So they did glute machine, a seated leg curl, an abductor machine, a leg extension machine, and an adductor machine. Similar reps and sets as the other group, followed by doing 30 minutes of aerobic exercise at 50% of their VO2 max on arm ergometer. They used DEXA and Skinfold in order to assess changes in body composition. The study took 12 weeks, and as with every study now, no changes proposed for the participants' diet. Now look at the results of the study, and this is where being critical in reading the full text comes in handy. So both groups lost almost a kilo of body weight. Upper body group saw a significant reduction in upper limb fat mass and a non-significant increase in upper limb lean mass. So they lost 0.4 kilos of fat but gained 0.3 kilos of lean mass. And the lower body group saw a significant reduction in lower limb fat mass and a significant increase in lower limb lean mass. So they lost 1.3 kilos and then they gained 1.1 kilo of lean mass. Groups experienced significant reductions in tricep and thigh skinfold measurements. So they essentially experienced a level of recomposition. They gained a bit of muscle, they lost a bit of fat. Obviously, this was also detected by DEXA, so we have to take that with a grain of salt. It's not that we're 100% sure that those changes did take part. They were, again, untrained individuals, but this is not a study that supports the idea that if myself, an experienced lifter, wants to preferentially lose more body fat from my abdomen or from my chest, doing more chest work while being in a deficit will allow me to lose more fat from that area. Potentially, if I gain more muscle, it may look more defined, but if we're assuming that you are an experienced individual who's been training for years and years and years, even that may not be the case, especially when in a calorie deficit. And moving forward to a 2023 study, very recently published, titled Abdominal Aerobic Endurance Exercise Reveals Spot Reduction Exists, a randomized controlled trial. So, untrained, overweight males, 29 of them, around 43 years old, and they had two groups, an abdominal endurance exercise group where they did 27 minutes on the treadmill at 70% of their heart rate max, and then followed with four-minute intervals and 30 to 40% of their 1RM in both directions on a torso rotation machine. And then they essentially rested for 5 minutes and performed another four-minute intervals on the abdominal crunch machine when they were training one side, the other side was resting, and that's what they did. So they did cardio and then direct ab work. It was not clear if they went to momentary failure, but they did direct oblique and ab work. Now, the control group, what they did was they ran at 70% of their heart rate max for 75 minutes. The authors here matched both groups for energy expenditure during exercise, and they measured body composition changes rather via DEXA and a variety of circumference measurements. And the study took 10 weeks. Similarly to literally every study that we've gone over, there were no changes in the participants' diets, but both groups lost a significant amount of weight. The group that did the direct ab work and the cardio lost around 1.5 kilos, and the other group actually lost 2.7 kilos. They noticed a significant reduction in trunk fat mass, lower extremities, and overall total fat mass for the group that performed the resistance training. But the group that did the abdominal work, the direct ab work, started at 28% body fat, and the control group started at 24% body fat. So the group that started at a higher body fat percentage lost more fat from areas that they exercised, but they also lost more fat from their lower extremities. It wasn't just the torso. It wasn't just the abs. So again, it's important to look at those details. We're talking about a group of overweight, untrained males, one group that experienced some form of spot reduction, also engaged in resistance training, and they lost body fat from other parts of their body too. However, it's also important to note that they started at a higher body fat percentage, and both groups lost a significant amount of weight. And lastly, and take this with a grain of salt, the use of DEXA and obviously circumference measures as a way to assess body composition is not the ideal way to assess body composition changes. I'm not saying to completely disregard what the study found, but it's important to take that and all the other limitations and terms and conditions in consideration before reaching any absolute conclusions about spot reduction. This sums up the majority of the current literature that is used as evidence pro spot reduction. The idea that you could, if you're an untrained individual, potentially preferentially lose body fat from an area that you're going to engage in resistance training in is apparently real, but pragmatically speaking and in the real world, if you're somebody who wants to lose body fat from a specific area, you can just train that area harder and you may lose more body fat. Obviously, the key to having an area appearing leaner than before is to build a ton of muscle and to lose body fat. So engaging in resistance training, consuming, a decent amount of protein, and just doing that progressively, and at some point being in a calorie deficit to lose body fat is still your best bet. Spending a whole lot of time thinking about ways that you can effectively further target body fat from specific areas is unfortunately going to be more on the waste of time side of the spectrum than not. If we're being pedantic and we're just discussing whether the phenomenon of spot reduction exists to a certain extent, it does, but the caveats and the terms and conditions that come with it are greater than some people out there may communicate. And very briefly, in addition to the studies that have been used as studies pro spot reduction being a thing, we have at least 5 studies showing that spot reduction did not occur in designs that were relatively ecologically valid and included things like doing a bunch of sit-ups, again, in untrained individuals. All the studies are linked below if you want to have a closer look. So overall, spot reduction, probably nothing you should be worried about. Focusing on being in a calorie deficit, engaging in progressive resistance training, and consuming plenty of protein are still your best ways to effectively build and sculpt your physique the way you want it to. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out strongerbyscience.com for amazing articles, an amazing podcast, amazing products like coaching. We have a team of amazing coaches that you could potentially work with, and a lot of other cool stuff, all related to all things lifting. So we'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.